Hi, in this demonstration I'm going to show how to implement inheritance using two simple classes. We'll have a base class called person and we'll have a derived class called student, which inherits everything and adds some additional features. So let me show you the base class first of all. We'll have a look at the header file, person.h. So this is quite a simple class, as you can see. The person class has one private field and a protected field. I've decided to make age protected in case the derived class wanted to access it. Then we have two constructors for the sake of the example. The first constructor has no arguments and initializes the person with simple values. And then we have a proper constructor which initializes the person properly. Plus, for the sake of interest, I have a display name age method there, which will display the person's name and age. So that's the simple definition for the person class. The implementation is quite simple as well. So in the person class, we have constructor, which initializes the name and age with made up values, if you like, and a little message here that will display on the console to indicate that this constructor has been called. That will be useful to help you understand the order in which constructors get called when you have inheritance. What you'll find is always the base class constructor that gets called first, followed by the derived constructor. So the object gets built from up from the ground up, if you like. So then we have a proper person constructor, which initializes the person with a given name and age, plus another message to say which constructor has been executed. And here's our simple message to display on the console. So that's the base class. Now let's have a look at the student class which inherits from it. So first of all, notice when you inherit, you have to include the whole of the header file for the base class. Obviously, the compiler needs to know everything about the base class so that it understands what inheritance means. For student, here we don't specify that student inherits publicly from person. Don't forget the public keyword. That's important. If you leave that out, the default is private, and public inheritance is what you want. It means that members in the base class, which are public, remain public when you inherit them, so they are still accessible in the derived class. So don't forget that. And then the student has additional data, as well as inheriting the name and age from person. It also has a course, a couple of constructors, a default constructor there, plus a constructor to initialize everything the student has, including inherited data such as name and age, plus the additional piece of data which is the course. And here we have another method which displays that course. So that's the definition for the student class. Now let's see how it's implemented. So a couple of interesting points here. In the constructor, the default constructor here, notice that we don't mention the base class. If you don't mention the base class constructor, the compiler will automatically invoke the no argument constructor anyway. It'll always invoke a base constructor, whether you want it or not. You can't avoid it. So if you don't mention the base class there, it will invoke the default constructor in the base class. And if your base class doesn't have a default constructor, then you have a compiler error. So this will invoke the default constructor from person to initialize the name and age with artificial values. Then, after that's finished, it'll fire up this code to set the course, and then it'll output a message to say that that's this constructor being executed. Now, our second constructor is a bit more interesting, a bit more explicit. In this constructor, we do call the person constructor explicitly. So that will call the base constructor to initialize the name and age with the values passed in to us. After that's finished, then we'll set our course property to the value that's been passed in, and we'll also display a message on the console. Okay, so that's our inheritance hierarchy. I have a very simple main application here in main.cpp to illustrate both the noarg constructor and the parameterized constructor. So first of all, I create a student using the noarg constructor that will implicitly invoke the person constructor with no arguments, and then I display the person's name and age and the course. Remember that the student inherits that method from the base class. It's still accessible to us in our client code. Then I create a student object using the parameterized constructors. This will invoke the second student constructor, which invokes the parameterized person constructor to set everything properly, and then we display that student's details on the console as well. So I'll run the application. And let's just have a look here. So for the first student object that got created, we have the person constructor with no arguments called first. Always the base constructor gets called first. Then the derived constructor, and these are the display methods: display name and age and display course. These are the methods that we've called here. And then these statements here come from the person constructor that took arguments and the student constructor that took arguments. So in our code, we call the student constructor, but underneath the surface, it will first of all call the base constructor, then it'll invoke our constructor. So the object gets built ground upwards. And as you can see, when we display the details, they have been set properly.